we continue looking at music of the Cold War era, particularly music from 1945 through the 1970s. From 1900 to 1945, the year that World War II ended, we see modernist composers pushing back against tradition and inventing new ways to create art and make music. During this time, there are two world wars that devastate humanity and the planet to a greater degree than had ever been experienced before. Following, there is a Cold War, a war essentially between particularly the major superpowers, including the United States and the Soviet Union. You can see this represented on this map by those countries in red, which were allied either economically or politically to the Soviet Union, and those in blue, which in some way, shape, or form were part of NATO, a North Atlantic trade alliance. This division was most keenly felt in Berlin, where the Berlin Wall divided symbolically West Germany and East Germany. And this border became a touchstone of the conflict that raged not in battle, but in trade and in politics, in spying, and even in art and in music between those countries allied with the Soviets and those not. Following the defeat of the Axis powers in World War II, which was the most destructive war yet seen upon the planet, tensions remained in Europe. By 1948, the Soviet Union, what was once called Russia, had installed communist governments in most Eastern European countries, symbolized by the division of Germany by the Berlin Wall. Punctuated by the deadly conflicts, including the Korean War and the Vietnam War, everything became a means of battle, symbolically, whether it was the space race, the athletic field, or culture. Amidst this, access to music grew, and popular music developed to include country and western, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, soul, folk, and protest music. Right now you hear in the background a protest song by Pete Seeger, or performed by Pete Seeger. This is "Last night I had the strangest dream I ever dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war." Many musicians desired that war would go away and that peace would reign. Pete Seeger, who was a legendary folk musician and banjo player, actually came to Peabody, and I had the distinct pleasure of having him speak at my graduation when I became a doctor at Peabody. Here's a picture of that. He was an incredible force, and it was also amazing to see not just a hero, but someone who is part of history right there in front of you. And we're able to see that in the 20th and 21st centuries. We're able to actually come into contact with people who have changed the way that music exists, how music is performed, and how music is shared. Let's begin with some composers of the Soviet Union. We'll begin with Sergei Prokofiev. Prokofiev cultivated a reputation as a radical modernist, but left Russia after the revolution. He lived in North America and Western Europe before returning to the Soviet Union in 1936. His commissions in Russia included the ballet Romeo and Juliet, the narrated orchestral work Peter and the Wolf, and film music for Alexander Nevsky. These were all written under strict government control. Though Prokofiev was not admonished as frequently as his compatriot Shostakovich, he was still criticized for being a formalist, despite his tonal and classical sounds. At this time, during the Cold War, being a formalist was essentially being declared someone interested in Western compositional thought, Western Europe. So if it sounded too serial or too dissonant, it was formalist. It was prescribing to a formal idea rather than some sort of pure, beautiful music. Now, at this time, it was largely up to Stalin and his cultural cronies to determine what was formalist and what wasn't. And sometimes it was just a whim. So appeasing the government was something that artists had to become proficient with. Let's take a listen to a little bit of Prokofiev's classical symphony. Interestingly, this is the first piece that he ended up writing completely away from the piano. Up until this point, he had composed partially at the piano, but was encouraged to write away from it. And he wrote this entire symphony away from the piano, only using his inner ear. And after this point, never went back again. You'll hear that there are certainly classical-like sounds, but with flashes of color and harmonic interest that make it slightly different, slightly more shimmering or jarring in some places. At roughly the same time, Dmitri Shostakovich was also active. Originally aligned with modernist composers, Shostakovich was criticized for his opera Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district because it angered Stalin as he decided that it was formalist. His Fifth Symphony in 1937 received great acclaim and was termed a Soviet artist's reply to just criticism, and is heroic and optimistic in the scope of Mahler. However, it has been interpreted as a secret protest against Stalinism. He later collaborated with the poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko on a choral work entitled Babi Yar, which concerns the ravine of the same name, where a series of massacres led by the Nazis occurred. You see Yevtushenko pictured here on the cover of Time magazine, and in a slightly less reverent picture, here with my brother giving him bunny ears. That's my brother over to the left, Yevtushenko in the middle, and myself on the right from a concert in the late first decade of the 2000s. This was sort of a fascinating event. Yevtushenko, after being a poet in the Soviet Union, moved to the United States and began teaching at all places the University of Tulsa, which is where my brother met him and collaborated with him. I also received a commission to write a piece for a musical theater work that they were putting on together, an evening of music and poetry. Bizarrely, after that, we ended up going out to eat at, of all places, a TGI Fridays. Here is an artistic figure who collaborated with Shostakovich, and I found myself eating onion rings across the table at a hallmark institution of American consumerism. It was very, very bizarre. Yevtushenko told us the story about how Shostakovich contacted him. Shostakovich actually called his house, called Yevtushenko's house, and Yevtushenko's mother picked up, and the voice said, "This is Dmitri Shostakovich. I'd like to speak to your son, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, about a poem he wrote." And his mother thought that this was a joke. Imagine being called up by John Williams or any prominent, famous composer, a well-known household name composer. So his mother hung up, thinking that it was a fake call. A few minutes later, the phone rings again, and the voice says, "This is Dmitri Shostakovich. Is Yevgeny Yevtushenko there?" And once again, Yevtushenko's mother hangs up. It's not for a little while when she realizes maybe this actually is Dmitri Shostakovich, and he wants to collaborate with my son. Again, what's fascinating here is to realize that these are real living people that have had impacts on the way that we live our life, and in this case, exist in this photo with bunny ears. Turning to the United States, one of the other superpowers at this time, there are a number of artists that are really pushing the boundaries even further than what modernist composers like Schoenberg and Stravinsky were doing. One is Edgar Varèse. French by birth, he studies at the Paris Conservatoire before moving to New York in 1915. He is known for experimenting with what are known as sound masses, that is, just creating music out of conglomerations of sound. He creates a liberation of timbre, a liberation of sound, just like Schoenberg created a liberation of dissonance. Varèse creates bodies of sound characterized by a particular timbre, register, rhythm, and melodic gesture. This is particularly evident in his 1931 work, for which he is, this is one of his more famous works, entitled Ionization. As you can hear, there is not just percussion, but also strange instruments as well, like sirens. This is not uncommon in Varèse's work. Turning to Henry Cowell, we see a composer who is interested in similar procedures, using tone clusters and extended techniques at the piano to evoke new sounds. By tone clusters, I mean groups of notes that are spaced just by a second, either a minor second or a major second. Imagine putting your hand just down on a group of keys on the keyboard. And by extended techniques, I mean using the instrument in a way that it is not normally used in terms of classical music. So for the piano, you might pluck the strings, or as his piece that related to Irish mythology, the Banshee, did, you would strum those strings. You'd pull on it, and you'd scrape the strings, and it would create a screeching sound. Cowell also taught at Peabody for a time. We'll take a listen to the Banshee, and you can hear this screaming, keening sound. In Irish mythology, the Banshee was a spirit, usually a spirit of the dead, or a spirit warning that someone would die, alternately either warning of death or causing death. The name comes from Bain She, Bain meaning pale, and She, actually originally spelled Sidhe in Gaelic, meant a fairy or an elf. So a pale fae. Here, a spirit proclaiming death. Certainly eerie indeed, and we'll hear the eerie music that accompanies this title. A name that you'll likely recognize is Aaron Copland. He's one of the first American students to study with Nadia Boulanger in Paris. She was an influential composition teacher and theorist in France. Aaron Copland became one of the central figures in American composition during the Cold War era. However, because he was Jewish, he was gay, and a liberal, he was brought before the Committee for Un-American Activities, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthyism at this time was interested in finding anyone who might be somehow connected with communism, which at this point was labeled an un-American activity. And artists, filmmakers, anyone of cultural influence, particularly if they were Jewish or gay or leftist, were frequently brought before the committee and made essentially to stand trial and defend themselves and prove that they were not communists. Copland was in good company, though. Fred Rogers was also brought to the stand. If you don't know who Fred Rogers is, he's famed in America for his children's show, Mr. Rogers, and was an unfailingly kind and considerate man. Copland's early works demonstrated a distinct modernist touch, which we don't really realize frequently because most of Copland's music that's performed is his Americana music. We'll see that some of this early music utilizes dissonant harmonies and developing variation, just like Schoenberg did. We'll see this in the piano variations, which we'll listen to in just a moment. He actually performed these piano variations in a showdown against Pierre Boulez, who is sort of the serialist bad boy of Paris. Later works by Copland display some modernist tendencies. His Second Symphony, for instance, utilizes similar harmonic and development procedures like Stravinsky. However, he also cultivates a sparse and consonant style that is deemed Americana. We hear this in works like Billy the Kid, the Billy the Kid suite, and also the suite from Appalachian Spring. But now some of the piano variations. You'll hear some extended techniques where the piano is left to resonate, and you'll also hear this developing variations idea, taking a small motive and spinning it out free of tonal control. In the United Kingdom, we see Benjamin Britten come to prominence. He's one of the foremost composers in Britain, particularly following World War II. There he created a modernist style that included simplicity and tonal idioms, as well as a free treatment of dissonance. He's renowned for his operas, which include Peter Grimes, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and The Turn of the Screw, as well as his vocal and choral music, which is sumptuous, beautiful, and at times biting. He has a wonderful way to create vocal lines and textures that are both singable, easy to grasp, but when combined together, create a modernist bite at times that make it fresh. He's deeply influenced by humanitarian concerns. He was a conscientious objector during World War II. And he displays this in his War Requiem, which is based on texts by the World War I poet Wilfred Owen. This work displays in part this pacifism that Benjamin Britten espoused. We'll hear a little bit of the Dies Irae movement of this. Remember that Dies Irae chant that we've been hearing throughout the course in different guises? Well, this is a different Dies Irae, and it takes the sounds of battle, of trumpet calls, and makes them into the day of wrath. In France, we have Olivier Messiaen. He's an organist by trade and became professor of harmony at the Paris Conservatoire in 1941. His students included influential musicians like Pierre Boulez and Karlheinz Stockhausen. Messiaen was deeply religious, and his music is often linked with Catholic subject matter. He was also deeply fascinated by birdsong, as well as being a synesthete. A synesthete is someone for whom the sensorial aspects of whether it's sound and sight, in the case of Messiaen, or other senses are essentially crossed. So Messiaen not only heard music, he also saw it. He saw colors when he heard sounds, and he heard colors, essentially, and saw sounds. We see a little snippet of this in this video where he is teaching a class about Debussy's Pelléas and Melisande. You'll notice that he goes through the piece and he talks about the harmony, and at a certain point you'll hear him describe the colors that he hears in the chord. And he asks the students about this. You'll see that they're slightly uncomfortable, but then one student pipes up, perhaps just slightly making fun, but Olivier Messiaen, being a sort of jolly fellow, goes along with it. See what you think. I'd be interested to know if any of you experience synesthesia. I certainly don't, but I do experience associations with keys and with notes. E major for me, I associate with red. I don't see red, but I associate it with that. C sharp major is sort of silver and blue, whereas C major is sort of a snow white and pure. A major is yellowish. See what you think as we take a listen to Messiaen teaching a little bit.
Mesdames, Messieurs, chers amis, chers administrés, asseyez-vous, je vous prie. Voilà, ce matin, je vous ai apporté Pelléas et Mélisande.
Alors voulez-vous me dire ce qui vous frappe dans ce passage? Il y a deux choses qui me frappent tout de suite. Il y a deux mots importants.
Loin.
Merci, il y a le mot loin, mais ils ont dit, je ne suis pas d'ici, je ne suis pas né là, je suis né loin. Loin, et elle le répète plusieurs fois, loin, c'est-à-dire que plus elle le répète, plus on s'éloigne, et plus on sent qu'elle n'appartient pas à notre planète, qu'elle est d'un autre monde, qu'elle est située sur un autre plan. Mais aussitôt Golo enchaîne et il nous dit, qu'est-ce qui brille ainsi au fond de l'eau? Est-ce que ça vous frappe pas cette phrase? Qu'est-ce qu'il y a d'extraordinaire dans cette phrase? Les reflets dans l'eau, c'est le titre d'une de ces pièces.
Poisson d'or.
Poisson d'or, mais enfin, tout Debussy, ce sont des choses sur l'eau et sur des choses qui brillent. Eh bien, je vais vous le jouer maintenant. Et puis, je vais aussi vous poser des questions.
Où êtes-vous né?
Alors, Golo lui dit, d'où êtes-vous né? Vous m'excusez, je chante très mal, mais ça n'a pas d'importance, j'ai une voix de compositeur, il faut bien. Elle répond, loin d'ici, loin.
Qu'est-ce qui brille ainsi?
Qu'est-ce qui brille ainsi au fond de l'eau? Je vous joue les deux, voilà la gamme partant. Et voilà la seconde présentation. C'est une couleur beaucoup plus chaude. Vous êtes d'accord, la première est plus froide, la seconde est plus chaude. Nous sommes d'accord sur ce point. Vous êtes d'accord pour un gris-violet pour la première? Ils sont toujours très inquiets pour les couleurs. Ceci, moi, me semble un oranger dans lequel il y a tout de même des pointes de bleu. Des pointes de vert.
Ah oui.
Le bleu et le vert, c'est froid, oui, mais c'est l'oranger qui domine.
Oui.
I always think this is fascinating to see Olivier Messiaen actually talking about the colors that he hears and sees. You'll notice that the videographer interpolated moments of opera singers singing the opera that wasn't someone in the class, in case there was any confusion there. Messiaen's musical language also includes the usage of symmetrical elements. This includes non-retrogradable rhythms, that is, rhythms that sound the same backwards and forwards. In other words, you can't turn them around because they're the same thing backwards or forwards. They are non-retrogradable. One example, a very simple example, would be a quarter note, a half note, and a quarter note. It's the same thing whether it goes backwards or forwards. But Messiaen is interested in much longer and more complicated instances of these non-retrogradable rhythms. Other symmetrical elements include the modes of limited transposition. By this, he means modes that have a more distinctly limited number of unique transpositions as compared to the diatonic scale. The diatonic scale has 7 distinct transpositions to it, essentially. That 7 distinct modes that can be created. So if we start C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, there are 7 distinct modes that can be created out of that pitch collection. However, if you take, for instance, the whole tone scale, the whole tone scale can only be transposed twice before it replicates itself. C, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, and then C would be a whole tone scale. You could transpose it up 1 half step, C sharp, D sharp, E sharp, etc., etc. But then once you transpose it up once more, it just starts replicating the same pitches as the first. Likewise, the octatonic scale only has 3 distinct availabilities to it. Another one work that displays some of these elements is the Quartet for the End of Time. This was written while Olivier Messiaen was a prisoner of war during World War II. Therefore, it's not just a political and religious statement, it's also a rhythmic and melodic statement as well. This was not just a meditation on the sense of the end of time for this terrible bloody conflict, or the end of time like the apocalypse in Catholic thought, but it's literally a study ending time musically, taking non-retrogradable rhythms and playing with time itself. In fact, we actually see that the first movement displays elements of an isorhythmic motet. We haven't talked about that since Module 3. An isorhythmic motet, remember, is a motet that has a pattern of pitches and a pattern of rhythms, and it plays them through, continually shifting them. It makes for an almost kaleidoscopic, gemstone-like performance as light shimmers off these different melodic and rhythmic aspects in different ways.